So far, we have learned how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide rational expressions. In this video, we are going to learn how to solve rational equations. Now remember, when I say rational, what I mean is fractions. So we are going to learn how to solve equations involving fractions. Let's start with something very simple. If I tell you that 3/5 equals x over 5, and I say, hey, what does x equal? Well, you can just look at the problem and realize that x has to equal 3. Because if these two equations are equal and you have a 5 on the bottom of each side, then obviously the tops must be equal as well. So the x has to equal 3. So what makes these problems much simpler is if you have a common denominator. So just like when we were adding and subtracting, that common denominator is going to be very, very important. So let's try one that's a little bit more challenging. X plus 5 over x minus 1 equals 2. Here we need to solve for x. Now, one thing I do want to start with is just a little reminder that when you have a fraction, you cannot divide by 0. So if the denominator is x minus 1, I'm going to set that equal to 0. That gives me x equals 1. No matter what I get whenever I solve this equation, I know that x cannot be 1. Because if I plug in 1 on the bottom, 1 minus 1 is 0, and you cannot divide by 0. All right, so let's try this thing. Now, we said in the previous slide that the best way to solve is to get a common denominator. Right now, this 2 has a denominator of 1. So just like we did when we were adding and subtracting, we want to figure out what to multiply by so that the denominators are exactly the same. Well, the other side is x minus 1, so I need to multiply by x minus 1. And whatever you do to the bottom, you also do to the top. So let's carry this down. The first fraction, x plus 5 over x minus 1, we didn't change anything. But over here, on top, I've got 2 times x is 2x, and 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. And on the bottom, 1 times x minus 1 would be x minus 1. So remember, now that the denominators are the same, we're really just solving whatever we've got on top. So really, I'm just looking at this thing and I'm thinking x plus 5 equals 2x minus 2. And I need to go through and solve for x. Right now I have x's on both sides, so I'm actually going to start by moving this x over here. So now I've got 5 equals x minus 2. And then to get this x by itself, I'm going to add 2, move it over to the other side. So I end up with 7. X equals 7. And that is my final answer. So the moral of the story, just to recap that, you want to start by getting a common denominator. If the denominators are not the same, you're going to multiply by something to make them be the same. Let's try another one. All right, let's try one last example here. Seen a couple of these by now. We know that we want to start by figuring out which values of x would be impossible. So looking at our denominator here, these both say x minus 4. So I know that no matter what, x can never, ever, ever equal positive 4. Because if you plug in a positive 4 right here, 4 minus 4 is 0, and you cannot divide by 0. Okay, so we start with that. Now, the second goal is going to be to get a common denominator all the way across. Now, both of these guys already have an x minus 4, but the 1 doesn't. The 1 over here on the other side, you can think of this as 1 over 1. We also need to have that common denominator over here as well. So I'm actually going to need to multiply by x minus 4. Of course, whatever you do to the bottom, you also have to do to the top. So 1 times x minus 4 would be x minus 4. On the bottom, 1 times x minus 4 would also be x minus 4. On the left-hand side, we already have a common denominator, so let's just add these things together. So combining like terms across the top, I've got 1x plus 7x equals 8x, and I've got 2 plus negative 42 is negative 40, all over our common denominator of x minus 4. Now, if the bottoms are equal, that means the tops must be equal also. So I'm going to take that equation that we see across the top, and I'm going to use this equation to solve for x. So this is just a regular linear equation. I need to get all of my like terms together, so I'm going to take this x here, I'm going to subtract it, move it to the other side. That gives me 7x minus 40 equals negative 4. And then trying to get x by itself here, I'm going to add 40, move it to the other side. That gives me 7x equals 36, and divide by 7 gives me 36 over 7. Not a very pretty answer, but it is the correct answer nonetheless.